Hey, it's almost gobble gobble day. I know everyone has seen the viral You Name It video. Every year is played around this time like a tradition. Well, I made a cookie set to go with the You Name It. And in this tutorial, I will show you how I made the food portion of that cookie set. The turkey. I start out by tracing a template. It was made because some of these cookies are hand cut. I used that same image to help me trace on a cookie. I cut out the detail areas and then I used my edible marker to mark up the cookie. From there, I flood the cookie using deep flood consistency icing. I like my turkeys to look well done. I flood each section waiting for them to crust in between. And by crust, I mean waiting for the top layer to dry. The plate is done with white flood consistency icing and so is the bone. Make sure to give it time to crust over and then you can add the garnish. I use orange and green medium consistency icing for this. It's supposed to look like baby carrots and whichever greens people prefer to put with their turkey. Once the cookie is completely dry, I do about 2 coats of poppy paint to give it a little shine. If you want a more glazed look, you should do about 3 or 4 coats. The beans, I start flooding the bowl area white, again using flood consistency icing. I give it time to crust over and from there I did the splatter effect. It's a quick way to make something plain look really cute. To do this, I take a new or a food use only toothbrush, dip it in some food coloring, and flick the bristles over the cookie. Next, we add the beans. I use brown medium consistency icing to do this part. It's just a bunch of dots and short lines that I applied in layers. I waited about 3 to 5 minutes in between each layer. Another way to do this would have been to just flood the top brown and then put some dots on top of it. But it didn't look as realistic to me, so I chose to do it this way. Line the top of the bowl and then do 2 coats of poppy paint. That's it for the beans. Make sure you don't spill them. That was corny. The greens. To make the pie, I used a round cutter for the circle and took 2 tiny pieces of dough, balled them up, and stuck them on opposite sides so it would look like the handles. I only outlined the circle portion of the cookie with black icing because the middle will be filled with the greens. And I made sure to leave small gaps when I was outlining the sides so they actually look like handles. I used the Maricolor Moss food coloring to create these greens. I started by painting the bare cookie using a wet brush and a little bit of color. Then I got my wafer paper and I painted this with the same Moss food coloring. But since wafer paper dissolves in water, I used a slightly damp brush to paint it on. So the brush is mainly food color with a tad bit of water. I wanted it to be several different shades because greens are not always the same exact color. So I painted the front and the back. And afterwards I realized painting the back wasn't necessary. But while the wafer paper is soft, start pulling it apart and placing it on the cookie. Now if the wafer paper doesn't stick, just add a tiny bit of water to your brush and brush it over the wafer paper. Now what I did was mix some color and some of the water together, so whenever I had to slightly dampen my brush to help the wafer paper stick, it also added some color. In the areas where my wafer paper wasn't as soft, I used that same brush with that little bit of color on it just to go over some of the pieces so they would fold in nicely and looked really cooked. Again, well done. While the wafer paper was still wet, I added some pink sprinkles because they're supposed to represent the meat that people usually add into their greens. Once the wafer paper was dry, I put about 3 coats of the poppy paint on it, and it is done. Next are the cookies that were in a square pan. I only show this part once since all 3 were done the same way. I marked the areas where I want the pan to be using an edible marker for some and a scribe tool for the others. Then I flooded them using either black or white flood consistency icing, again leaving gaps for the handle. Then I let that section dry. Starting with the lasagna, I used red flood icing and let the top crust over. Then I mashed it with a brush. I did this so it would have texture. While the red icing was still wet, I put white flood consistency icing on top. Now I know you're like, what's the point of doing all that stuff with the red icing if you're just gonna cover it up? But trust me, it makes a difference. When the cookie is done, those same pieces will help it look like the ripples under the cheese, just like real lasagna. Okay, from here I add some dots of green and lines of yellow icing, all while the white icing is still wet. I use my scribe tool to mix up all the colors. You could stop here because it looks pretty good, but for me, I wanted to keep going because I wanted to look like the lasagna I'm used to seeing. So I took a tiny bit of yellow food dust, dry dusted the top of the cookie, and from there I put about 2 to 3 layers of the poppy paints. I pretty much put poppy paint on all of the cookies, so I'll say it this last time so that way I don't have to keep saying it over and over. Next are the yams. I used orange stiff consistency icing for these. I just made a bunch of small squares all over the pan. Since it's stiff consistency icing, you don't have to wait in between to add layers. From there, I use white flood icing on top. It's supposed to represent the marshmallows people put on top of real yams. Now you can stop at this point if you like, but again, I wanted them to look like what I'm used to seeing. So once that dried, I put another layer of white icing on top. I let it crust over. Then I used a mixture of dry dust colors to create that burnt on top look. So the colors are Rustic, Brown, and Turkish Black. I'll make sure to link all of this down below. Now as I'm dusting the color on the top, I'm smashing the icing a bit, sort of like I did with the lasagna, so that way you can see some of the white come through, just like you would see when you toast real marshmallows. Now let this dry completely, then you add your 2 to 3 coats of shine. I think I did 3. The baked mac and cheese. I start by squeezing some of the stiff yellow consistency icing all over the bare part of the cookie. Then I use a wet brush to spread it. This will make the pan look fuller. From there, I outline the inner parts of the pan with tiny little C's, so they look like little pieces of macaroni. You can do as many C's as you want, depending on how high you want the cookie. These look so real. After this, we will repeat the first step. Using the thick consistency icing, we will squeeze it all over the middle and use the wet brush to spread it. This is supposed to look like the top layer of cheese that covers the macaroni. From here, we will pull out our dry dust. I used yellow and rustic to dust over the top because I wanted it to look toasty, but at the same time, you can still see that golden color. Okay, so while I was recording, I dropped some brown dust on the cookie, so I had to stop here. because I could not get all of it up. But the next steps are pretty much wait for your cookie to dry and then give it 2 to 3 coats of shine. Last but not least, we have the ham. This cookie was also hand cut, so I used a template to trace the shape on the cookie. From there, I flooded the cookie with the same deep brown icing because, again, I want my stuff to look well done. Once that crusted over, I used powder pink flood consistency icing to fill in the front part of the ham. I let that crust over. Then I filled in the plate area using white flood consistency icing. Once it was dry, I added the carrots and the greens, aka my orange and green medium consistency icing. My camera died while I was drawing the lines of the ham, so I'll give you a quick rundown. I drew 5 vertical lines following the height of the ham, and then I drew 5 horizontal lines following the length of the ham. From there, I added a white circle in the front of the ham to represent the bone that you usually see in them. Once that crusted over, I added some of my pink dust to make the front of the ham look more realistic. I waited for all of this to dry, and then I added about 3 coats of the poppy paint. That's it for this set. I hope you enjoyed this video. I don't know about y'all, but I can't wait to eat the real thing. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Happy holidays!